morning, everyone. And Chazak Baruch. I'm going to continue with this letter from the bigwig in Johannesburg, South Africa, who's pressing the Lubavitcher Rebbe on his attitude towards Aliyah. And the Rebbe has responded in the first part by saying that he's not against Aliyah per se, that he gives proof of the enormous support that he's given to Israel both in the Chabad community and in his advice to many others. But he says lots of things are wrong in terms of the way in which Aliyah is conducted. It's hyped up, and as a consequence, many people who are really not suited to make Aliyah will end up doing so. And he gave an example of the Moroccan community, he said, which was a complete and total disaster because the leaders were persuaded to make Aliyah on the basis that everybody would follow. What happened was this incredible, long-standing community, a harmonious Jewish community living in a benign Arab country, basically fell apart as a result of that. Those who were left behind became despondent, and thousands of Moroccan Jews, instead of making Aliyah to following their leaders to Israel, went to France instead, and they were faced forces of assimilation for which they were completely and totally unprepared. Hello, Barbara. We're going to come back to you in a few moments for your yahrzeit. And then he goes on to talk about Yerida. And of course, once again, Yerida is the opposite of Aliyah. Going to live in Israel is called Aliyah in the sense of going up, not because the land of Israel is geographically higher than other countries, but because it's considered to be an ascent in terms of one's own personal status and one's own spiritual well-being. Aliyah, I'm going up. If subsequently then you leave the country, it is called Yerida, the opposite. It's called going down, descending, leaving something precious behind. And of course, there has been an enormous amount of Yerida as well in recent years. And he says that's not solely due to the lack of proper screening or selectivity, or the exaggerated promises and prospects offered to New Olim. A very substantial number of the Yoredim are in fact native born. As we know, there are huge numbers of native Israelis, indigenous Israelis who are living in other parts of the world, and says the Rebbe, it's a very painful subject in itself. But talking about Olim who have become Yoredim, or of their children who have grown up and have also become Yoredim, the disenchantment, he suggests, of some of the Olim is not always rooted in economics, although the situation could have been better had there been closer coordination between the Aliyah department and the absorption agencies. But ultimately, for those who are making Aliyah to Israel, it's not the promise of a nicer apartment or a better job or of higher standards of living that will satisfy an olah from the free world. You're never going to be able to get in Israel what you can get in England or in America. That's the reality. It's just not going to be the same in terms of material prosperity. So its uniqueness derives from what he describes over here as the spiritual quality, the fact that it is the Holy Land. And I'll come back to this in a moment. If all the accent were placed on the material aspects of life, with total disregard of this essential point, namely that the true and the lasting Aliyah is inseparable from a spiritual Aliyah, there will inevitably be Yoredim, or at the very least, disgruntled and embittered foreigners whose hearts and minds will be elsewhere. And such an Olah is not likely to recommend relatives and friends back in his country of origin to follow in his footsteps. And I think that what he's getting at over here is when he's talking about the spiritual qualities of it. There's an expectation when you come to Israel, when you make Aliyah to Israel, that quite apart from the circumstances in which one lives, the housing, etc., the bureaucracy that you encounter, but when you have a sense that you are expecting something higher from the standards of government, from the standards of conduct of the people, etc. And when you discover that it is possibly, elements of corruption, or that there is some forms of protectia which disadvantage some people and advantage other people, you become these Olim who have had this kind of idealistic idea, this sense that going to Israel is going to be, I'm going to have a better, more wholesome life. It's going to be better for me in terms of what my expectations of the way in which the country conducts itself and runs. And this would be particularly the case from countries like South Africa, where people are making aliyah because they are dissatisfied with the inadequacies of the country, things falling apart, it's not working properly. And you come to Israel with all of these big expectations, only to discover that actually it's sometimes, just not there. And those are the sorts of things that the Rebbe is saying, if you go and you're prepared for this and etc. But if it's all hyped up about aliyah, 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 and big Zionist ideal, etc., and people unsuitable, people who are not suited to make aliyah or make aliyah, he said it's a disaster. It's going to lead to Yerida in the end and to disaffection, and therefore he comes back to the point over here that aliyah is important, but it has to be done in a much more thoughtful kind of way and a much more selective process and a preparation for people to manage their expectations of what it is that they're coming to the country they're coming to live in, and not to hype it up in such a case to such an extent that it becomes a crashing disappointment when you arrive, and leading ultimately to disenchantment and causing you to leave the country, or for your children, one generation, to leave the country because the dream simply hasn't worked out. And I think that's kind of like a sensible approach. He goes on to speak, by the way, about the problem of nishira, which is another problem. Nishira means dropouts. And then he goes on to talk directly to respond to this person from Johannesburg, South Africa, to speak about, in the Rebbe's opinion, about the massive aliyah that has taken place from South Africa and his views about that. But if you're still interested, we'll look at that in the coming days. Okay, so